Hello, everybody. Welcome. We're excited you're here for this interactive conversation with award-winning linguist and naming expert Anthony Shore of Operative Words. So he's named things like FitBit, Virgin, Plume, just to name a few, and pioneered use of computational linguistics in brand name development as an adjunct to creative thinking. So that opens a whole new perspective, otherwise unachievable. So we want to make this super interactive. So post your questions in the Q&A chat on the right, and we'll do our best to address them. And also, Anth has a bunch of very actionable links and suggestions, and we're going to post them in the chat, but have no fear, we're also going to make those available to you afterwards in a list, so you don't have to be frantically trying to save all these links and things like that. So Anth has been great about sharing those with us. So to get us warmed up today, let's do an icebreaker. So when I say go, post in the chat the name of a product or service that first hooked you with its name. Ready? Go. Oh. Adam Corey, I think you jumped the gun before gun. Peloton, very interesting. Peloton non-obvious. That's interesting. And Headspace, very popular. Thrive Market. Okay, good. Nest. Okay, all right. So now we're warmed up, and you've seen the chat in action. Now, Anth, I'll tee it over to you with a question. Is there a framework for generating names that are original, memorable, relevant, and available these days?
Thanks, Ann. That's a big question. The short answer is yes, but it's got many parts to it. So if you don't mind, I'll talk to you a little bit about the framework, which I really see primarily as having two parts to getting a name that's the kind of name that you probably want when you're coming up with names. And those two parts are really having the right mindset and having the right tool set, okay? So having the right mindset is in part having the right expectations, having realistic expectations, okay? For example, to find a name that's available, you should expect it's gonna require a lot of name development. You know, when my team develop names, we're developing thousands and thousands of names for every project, right? Sometimes it's a couple thousand for each round of work, right? So it takes a lot of quantity to get to quality, especially names that are going to clear, okay? Part of the mindset is also having the expectations about, are you gonna know it when you see it? Is it gonna jump off the page? And no, it's not. No, because when we're compelled to come up with a legally available name, it has to be original, right? I mean, that's really the nature of it. And there's something I call the brander's paradox, okay? That as people who brand things, there's a mandate to come up with original ideas, right? But original ideas are, for whatever evolutionary reason, the kinds of ideas that can make us uncomfortable, ideas that we might reject initially because they're unfamiliar to us, right? But these unfamiliar ideas are only unfamiliar initially. Once it's out there, once it sits with you, and once a name, an unfamiliar one, is seen in context, or it's had validity conferred upon it, because it's actually been adopted and launched, then we feel very comfortable with the names. But when you're looking at a list, you shouldn't expect it's gonna jump off the page, and often the best ideas are probably the ones that are gonna make you very uncomfortable, right? So that's part of the expectations that we should have in our mindset. The other part of the mindset in developing names that are gonna be relevant, et cetera, is the strategic intent and establishing objectives for the name, right? Now, the way I like to articulate those objectives follow a framework, a formula of the name should support or connote among these ideas, all right? And typically higher order ideas. If you want to think about attributes at their most expansive sort of level. And in doing so, you are going to find the most paths for creative development, for pursuing creative routes in abundance. And that's really necessary in order to find ideas that are original, because guess what? The ideas that you start looking at and start exploring in your development, and me and my team too, are ones everyone else has done. That's the low-hanging fruit, right? So anything that's obvious and seems like a quick get at first go is probably already taken, right? So you need to go beyond that to these other areas. I'll continue on mindset if I'm not talking too much here at one go. And it has to do with memorability. You mentioned that. What about names that are memorable? And there is a framework for memorability. There are factors, specific factors that contribute to a name's memorability. So for example, if a name is picturable, okay, if you hear a word and you can picture it, that tends to be something that's going to be more memorable. So blackberry or gray goose, right? Those are picturable. They're in your mind. You can see it. It's vivid. It's concrete. Additionally, names that elicit emotion, some kind of emotional response, or surprise. Surprise like, oh, I didn't expect this kind of name in this category, right? Those are the kinds of names that are going to be more memorable because they're emotional. You know, if there's a word that we already connect with at a different level for different reasons, that's going to be more memorable than something that's utterly new to you, right? Then there's poetic devices, all right? So poetic techniques that also increase memorability of a word. So a name that incorporates rhyme or alliteration or assonance, where an internal vowel to a word or several words is common throughout. Meter and just euphony, it sounds good. These are things that contribute to memorability. And lastly, generally speaking, as a rule, all other things being equal, real words tend to be more memorable than made up ones, often for the reasons I've said, because it's something you already know, you're familiar with, and it's easier to like plant a notation in your mind, a signpost saying that this word now also means this thing, rather than create something new out of scratch, right? And we think about a good comparison here. You know, I mentioned BlackBerry. BlackBerry, a memorable name. Its original name was Pocket Link, okay? Not memorable. But you can see a name like Pocket Link would make eminent sense to a room full of, you know, founders, engineers, whatever, who might look at it and say, this is what it does at kind of a literal level, not to besmirch engineers or anything like that. I've got an engineer, I'm engineering minded myself, right? But you need to go beyond the literal and have faith and trust that your customers, your clients, whomever they may be, are going to be able to make a connection between that word, even if it's from some totally different realm, and your product, because you have paired them together and voila, you've made the connection for them, and now you have an unforgettable name that's an asset and is hopefully legally available to you. All right. So those are some of the factors that comprise the mindset in the framework for generating names that are original, memorable, and so
Great.
on.
And can I build on that? I was at Monster, which was in the HR space, monster.com. And we used to say we're worth billions of dollars, and career builder, which is the descriptive term in the industry, is worth a fraction of what we are, because it just didn't resonate as much. So, and can we bring up a question now from the audience? So Gal, glad you could join us today. Please introduce yourself, a little bit, your company and your one-liner, and then your question.
Hello, so thanks for having me. I'm a full stack lead at Takuda. We are dealing with the future of work and improving transparency within companies. And my question was, how do you tackle cultural differences in a globalized environment?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's a good question. So here's the truth is that Steve Martin used to say, those French, they have a different word for everything, right? And it's true that when you're coming up with names that you're going to be drawing from some language, and it might not be the language of your target audience or of all of them, right? For global brands, that's going to be inevitable. So there's going to be decisions that you need to make, right? If your market is, you need to look at the size, your relative size of your markets, right? If you're looking for targeting mostly an English-speaking market, but a little bit beyond that, you should ask yourself, do we want to have a name that's a total home run for English speakers, where they get that's memorable, extendable, viral within that context and so on, but it may be an unfamiliar word to those who don't speak English or for whom English isn't their first language, and there's kind of a trade-off there, right? Yeah, you consider the name Samsung, right? And for those of us who don't know Korean, we don't know that it actually means 3 stars in Korean, right? So, but amongst the audiences in Seoul, they know Samsung means 3 stars, right? Versus another name where say BlackBerry or whatever, and people in Seoul may not, if they don't speak English, they may not know that. So there's gonna be some trade-offs. Now, there are certain things I've noticed in naming internationally, and is that in Europe, non-speaking, non-English countries, and in Asia, broadly speaking, there is a preference for coined words, right? Made up words, rather than necessarily real English words, right? So it tends to be that if you can come up with a good story between a name that's comprised of sort of Latin or Greek word parts or some other language even, as long as it sounds good, okay, there's going to be a ready acceptance of a word like that. Okay, so that's one thing. And so there is a choice point that happens when you're developing a name. All right, do we want to use an English word and have it be a home run here? Or do we want a coin name that might work generally well, overseas, but might have a little bit more, take a little more work to gain acceptance here in the US? The other dimension of this that is implicit to your question is appropriateness, right? So what if we choose a word that turns out to be very similar or identical to a word in another language, and that word is inappropriate, okay? It happens to coincidentally be something obscene or scandalous, right? Well, it has happened. There's a story about the Chevy Nova not selling well in Latin America because Nova sounds like Nova, it doesn't go, but that's actually a myth. And this is the really crazy part, is that GM knew Nova sounded like their car, the Nova, and they knew it could be a problem, and they launched it anyway, and it wasn't a problem at all. Now, what do you do with that? What do you do when you're checking names and we find out, wow, gosh, it sounds really similar to this word that's antithetical to our message? What do we do with that? And they launched it and it did just fine, right? So there is a lesson here. First of all, the slight difference between Nova and Nova, 2 words, different stress, was sufficient to mitigate that potential problem. So that's an important lesson. It wasn't exact. Now, here's the other thing. Nova, it kind of became a problem because a US reporter who knew a little Spanish promoted this story, said, hey, would you look at how stupid GM is? They chose a name that means it doesn't go in their target market. And so there was a PR problem with Nova, but it wasn't from Latin America. It was from a reporter who made hay of something that really wasn't a problem.
And,
right?
Yeah. Can we dig in though? How do you test these names?
Yeah, that's a good question. When you do native speaker tests, checks, I have a very specific series of questionnaires that I've done that I posted in on my blog in an article called Red Flags and Red Herrings. How to conduct native speaker checks. And a very specific questionnaire that gets to how do you pronounce this word exactly in your language? And I try to use something like the International Phonetic Alphabet or something where I can get a close read on how it's actually pronounced. And then if they say it sounds like another word, I want to know the pronunciation of that word so that I can look at the proximity of these 2 words and how they sound and make a judgment as to whether or not it's likely to happen or not. Additionally, I ask 3 native speakers independently these questions. Does one person have this association, or do all 3 people have this association? That way you can grade the likelihood of, is this going to be a problem or not?
And so you're doing pretty small scale, like you're not doing a large survey, you're not buying Facebook ads.
It's a red flag check. Yeah, that's right. So in the work I'm doing, it's really just a red flag kind of disaster check. It's not full-blown market research, right? It's really more scaled down than that, sort of a surgical aspect. Now, you could be more robust about it. You could do a survey and ask similar questions or something like it, and then you would be able to get something that might be a little more valid or projectable because you got more data to work on. That's always an option, but I haven't really seen that done expressly for native speaker checks.
Got it. And I think we might have taken you a little bit off track. Are there any other tool sets that you want to bring up?
Yeah, so I haven't actually, on tools themselves, there's a couple aspects to this. One is software and one is techniques, right? So for software, and in my blog, I give away everything that I know. And I do that because I don't want to look at your terrible names. I want you to be good namers or good judges of names. I don't want to look at your shitty names, all right? And I really do give away everything because I want my competitors to name well. I want my clients to name well. I want you to name well, or at least be a good judge of names. Okay, so there's some tools that I use that are invaluable. One of them is a site called Rhyme Zone, and not for the rhyme feature as much as the ability to search within definitions. So if there's an attribute I want to evoke in my brand, like say it's strong or fast or small or whatever, Rhyme Zone allows you to search for that word within the definitions of other words, and therefore look for ideas that are aligned with yours but are also non-obvious. There's a site there I adore called Wordnik, Word-N-I-K, where people compose lists of words that are related in some ways, and that's a trove. You've also got a site and a framework called WordNet that came out of Princeton, where they organize ideas hierarchically. Is kind of a topology and a taxonomy that they put together to organize ideas. And that's very valuable for name exploration. And there's a lot of sites that leverage WordNet, such as Visual Thesaurus. The last two I'll mention are a corpus linguistics engine that I use called Sketch Engine, which is crazy powerful. And I actually wrote a blog post about it called the world's most powerful naming tool, and it is. And what it allows you to do is to take advantage of a 35 billion word corpus that's been indexed and organized and identify words that co-locate near other words. And therefore, in looking for one word, you can find other words near it. And it's very powerful. And it compels you to look at ideas that you would never consider looking at. And I find that very valuable. And then the last software tool I've been using are neural networks. So I've been doing this for a couple years. Started off using GPT-2, which I still use on occasion. Really powerful if you can manage using the interface, the command line interface to it, and train the neural network on the right data set. Often I scrape those data sets from Sketch Engine, right, to get a robust sort of training data set. And then lately, thank you Village Global, GPT-3, which I've been using as well, which so far, my take on GPT-3 is that it's feral. And it's a little like trying to get a cat to do what you want it to do. Sometimes it scoffs, sometimes it'll allow it. So I still have a way to go to wrangle that.
That's
so
great.
Those are software tools.
Okay, wait, and can we pause because we have a question from Alexandria. Yeah. So we're going to bring her up to the stage. Hey, Alexandria, please introduce yourself, your company one-liner, and pose your question. Hello.
I can't hear you. I don't know if you can hear me.
We can hear you.
Okay. Interesting. So I'll ask.
Oh no, we lost her.
We lost you.
Okay. I am channeling Alexandria right now. If you are trying to develop a new market or adjacent sub-market of an existing market, are there unique naming criteria that you would take into consideration? You want me to read that again?
Yeah, no, I got it. It's actually showing up here, subtitles here. It's actually so very helpful. That's a really good point. So when it comes time to develop a new market, you want to think about how your name can signal that you're a new market, right? And that if you follow existing name conventions or something that's typical for the category, You're not using the name in a way that you could be to signal that this is something new. Okay, and so often it's useful to take a look at the names that are in the category that's adjacent to you and say, let's do something different here, right? If you're able to ascertain kind of white space that might be possible. I can tell you when it comes to competitive differentiation in names, I had an interesting experience working with Qualcomm many years ago, where they were developing a chipset, and they were going into a market dominated by Intel and AMD, who had names like Centrino and Athlon, and all of their names sounded the same. And so for Qualcomm, in order to get the sense that they're creating something totally new, I observed that these competitors aren't using words based on Old English, what used to be called Anglo-Saxon. And so I said, let's go ahead and look at words that are born out of Old English and not coined Latin and Greek words, right? And so that ended up taking us to the name Snapdragon, which is a name you might be familiar with today. And it was all born out of this competitive analysis of what are current companies doing and how do we stand out and signal that we're different. So.
And let me follow up with another of Alexandria's questions. What are the decision criteria for determining when and whether to use a name that has a common connotation already or a name that's made up?
Well, it's my belief, it's my bias, I'll come right out, that if your name arrives with meaning, if your name is already something as a word people are familiar with, but you're using it in a way, in a context that's different, that's going to do kind of the most work for you. Okay. So you can create a totally new word and invest in it. And my gosh, after 50 years, Kodak, a meaningless word, means something, right? But I believe it takes a lot of time and a lot of money to do that, where you can really hit the ground sprinting. Now, I'm not saying that you come up with a word that's endemic to a category or already diluted in a category. It's not that. It's about using a word people already know that might be surprising in this context. And I will also couch this with, that is also a little bit of an Anglo-centric perspective, an English speaker's perspective, because as I mentioned, generally in Asia and often in non-English European countries, they tend to cotton to coined words as long as they're euphonic. Right, and those names may not be as strong initially here in the U.S. It's going to take more time. So again, you want to take a look at your markets. What markets are most important to you, and then I say you aim for a home run in that market, right? Rather than something that's just going to be a double everywhere. Fall short everywhere.
Okay, so and one more follow-up question, then we'll go back to kind of more of the agenda. How much time and effort is involved in a typical early stage startup name search project for you?
Well, by and large, most projects are 6 weeks, and there's 2 rounds of creative and screening that we do. It really doesn't matter whether we're naming for a startup or for a big company. The same effort is put into it no matter what, because you need to get to a clear names at the end of the day and a robust selection such that the client in the room, all the people there's going to be enough names that are going to rise to the top that they can all agree to. And that means that over a couple of rounds, we're developing thousands of names. We're screening hundreds of names internally here. We do a preliminary knockout screening of typically 300 names for a project. And then we present typically at least 100 names that have passed that screening, right? And that, in my experience, has been what's necessary to get to a couple of names that the team can all agree on. Now, not everyone in naming has this perspective. There's other naming companies who present 10 names and say that's it. I'm too risk averse, I think, to do that. I don't really have the stomach for it. So that's why I put so much into naming irrespective of the client size.
Got it. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit. And can you tell us about nomenclature and naming system best practices?
Yeah. So I saw in those questions, a lot of people asked about nomenclature. So the first thing, almost the only thing, is taking on your customer's perspective, your client's perspective. Who is using the nomenclature? That's it. I mean, that is so very important. you need to have an understanding about how they see things, how they're buying, how they're choosing, whatever the situation is, in order to help them. Because nomenclature, that is a naming system, exists in order to help people understand your products, how they relate to each other, and to choose the one that's right for them. That, by and large, is why nomenclature exists. Right, so you want to have a mindset where you're adopting a customer's perspective. Often, engineers within the company, product developers within the company, there's a perspective they have that may reflect your own organization, your own org chart, right, or other things that aren't really germane or relevant to customers. So, the most important thing is that everything is born out of adopting the customer perspective. Additionally, names should not be multiplied beyond necessity, right? There is sometimes a temptation to name every little thing uniquely, right? And I can understand that. You put a lot of time and effort. Everyone wants to, they want to name the baby, and that's understandable. But that may not be what's ultimately right for you, especially as a startup. Often, when you're dealing with line extensions and a series of products, often the right thing to do is to adopt a branded house kind of brand architecture. That is that you have your company brand, and then your products use clear, descriptive words to create sort of the differentiation of products within the portfolio. And that way you're investing in building that corporate brand, and the descriptors reflect something that is relevant and important to your audiences. So you need to be judicious about naming products and not give everything a unique name, because that's going to make your job harder. It's going to make the customer's job harder. Now, there may be instances where, it does make sense for us to have some kind of nomenclature system. People look at systems like Apple's, where they have Mac this or I that, right? Or other companies may have a themed sort of nomenclature system. And, I'm not going to say abandon all hope, ye who enter in, but those systems do make your job harder. And I'll tell you why, because it's not something anyone anticipates, is that you come up with a name for this product and it's got a prefix that you like, or it follows a metaphor or a theme you'd like to use. And then you start extending it to other products, right? You start coming with the names for this. You're going to find you keep bumping into trademark availability issues for those other names, okay? And so you may find that you could get one product in the nomenclature system that's legally available, but to find another product with the same prefix, suffix, or theme, you've got to come up with something like really weird, right? Or something that just doesn't make sense or is a total reach, right? So it can be done. It's just a tougher road to hoe to get there and to do it well. And you need to ask yourself, are we better off naming each product individually, like when it's appropriate strategy, and make that a great name, and make this other product name, right, a great name in and of itself, rather than have something that's kind of cohesive on a whiteboard, right, sort of thematically, that kind of idea. I tend to recommend, let's just give this product the best possible name it can have, and we'll give this product the best possible name it can have, even if they're linguistically or semantically sort of from slightly different places. So that's part of my perspective on nomenclature.
Super helpful. So let's bring Peter up, who has a question for you. Peter,
hey.
please.
Hello, Peter.
Hi, I'm Pete Skamrock. Company is Data Wrangling, where I do consulting and advising on AI and machine learning. So my question is around how much time and effort is typically involved for early stage startup branding, renaming. In particular, I do a lot of angel investing, early stage startups, maybe pick a name from a hat at the beginning to incorporate and lock in their co-founder, and then build up a code base, and it feels very painful. And the early team wants to be involved. So the question is really, in that kind of situation, what does it typically entail, and why should startups seek your help? Because I think they should.
Yeah, thanks for that question. There's a lot of my work. So I work with big established companies, but I do a lot of work with companies just like yours, and they arrive to me often with a name that they've had, and they've been using, it's been kind of a placeholder. Sometimes they kind of like it, and sometimes they know it's crap and it's going to have to change at some point. And at a certain point, they make a judgment call as to say, okay, now is the time that we invest in getting some proper naming. I honestly don't know exactly the minutia of where in their funding and what stage they're at when they actually make that call. But I can say this, that if you have like a good name and a story to back it up, when it comes time to raising more funds, that can be persuasive and helpful in eliciting interest and making it, clear that you have your act together, that you're sort of one or two steps ahead. So I think it can be helpful in those instances, especially when it comes time, because you're going to end up raising more funds, and the name can help get you traction, establish credibility. It shows that you as a management team are making good decisions, sort of from a branding standpoint. But there's also the reality that if you're early enough and you're really on really seed money shoestring, it may not make sense yet, until you can go ahead and get a little bit more traction before you invest in the name. So I can't tell you, what that line is, but I can say I've talked to clients who are just before they go out to their Series A, and others who are just after it. So it's both.
How critical? Just one quick follow-up. How critical do you think it is if a bad actor enters the scene with a name, similar to your startup? So, for example, Parlor. If you had or we have Clubhouse. I guess Clubhouse is popular now, but for a while there were some negative things with Clubhouse, and the other Clubhouse was kind of battling them on the name.
Well, for one, if there is another company who has entered the scene after you and they have a confusingly similar name to yours, that's easy. You need to make them stop with a cease and desist order because they're infringing on your trademark. And by the way, technically in America, you don't actually have to file for trademark protection to get it. Simply using the name in commerce affords you certain rights to the name. Now, if that other company, as it turns out, got there before you, guess who's infringing, right? So on that, in that situation, you want to sort of be mindful, and yeah, you need to get the lawyers involved. If someone's coming up with a name that's designed to confuse or even looks confusingly similar to yours because they're offering similar goods and services and their name sounds like yours or something else like that, then you have legitimate means to put an end to it. If someone else in an entirely unrelated place, has a name and enters, well, then it depends. Like Visa launched a card of some kind of payment system called ISIS, right? And then, ISIS happened, and then, oh shit. So then they changed the name to SoftCard, right? So there's nothing you can do, this sort of infamy, that the name took on because of a terrorist organization, and who could have predicted that, right? So that's one of these situations where shit happens. You got to deal with it, and sometimes you need to change the name, like ISIS did, like the old diet chocolate candy called AIDS had to change its name. They take on infamy. It's and the name has to die. So and go away and be replaced with something that isn't associated with a disease or a terrorist organization.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, well, I think we have another question coming up from. Great.
Hi, I'm Shahryar, co-founder of MetaView. We help organizations get much better at performing job interviews. And we use technology to do that. My question was, as a company, as we were mentioning in the previous question, we kind of pick a name, not at random, but maybe not as thoughtful as we should be. And you grow and you do well. And there comes a point where whilst the name originally maybe made sense in the context of your business, it no longer does, but everyone knows about you. And there's, you have a brand. Now, is it, given that within the new context, after all your iterations, etc., the name no longer makes sense, is it short-sighted not to consider changing your name because you think like a lot of people are recognizing and know it? or there comes a point where your brand is your brand and just stick with it?
That's a good question, and definitely a question I've heard a lot of earlier companies, but even companies in the growth stage ask, because what do you do? My take on it is this: if the name is your current name that you have is adding friction, right? At long-term friction. So despite the fact that you've enjoyed growth, it's not a name that is really an asset for you long-term, and it's adding friction for you long-term. And generally, I would advise a company to take a look at what they're really going to be doing long-term, to look at that clearly, as far-sighted as possible in terms of the roadmap, the directions, the reason for being, and to consider a name change. Now, what about our equity? What about our audience? This is I've helped change so many companies' names, and I've seen exactly what happens. And clients think they're stepping off a cliff when they do this, and it's stepping off a curb, right? Because the people who know you are a captive audience. It is so easy to tell them, hey, we used to be this, and now we're this, and boom, and that transition is actually so much easier to make than it's expected. And I've never heard of a company like suffering significant loss of customers or anything by virtue of a name change like that, so long as it's well handled. In other words, you got to alert people to the name change. It's a good idea to, in your identity, you include the new name and say something like formerly known as, but I've seen companies time and again transfer massive equity to a new name, right? So I was lucky enough to lead the Accenture. And see Anderson Consulting transfer all that equity over to to the name Accenture, and 150 million in first year advertising helps, right? But even PepsiCo restaurants becoming Yum, they were PepsiCo, what a great brand, and then they were Yum, and then eventually they take on their own sort of identity. So I would look at it long term and think about how the name is really, if it doesn't fit anymore, it could end up just being adding friction, making things more difficult for you and hindering your growth long term, versus a new name. You do that transition, you manage it carefully, and then you've got an asset you can build on that's going to give you forward momentum into the future.
Thanks so much.
Great. So there's a question here I'm going to read, which is, as a startup with a single product, how do you feel about leaving the product named as the company versus creating a standalone product name?
That's a great question. And I'll go back to my perspective that names should not be multiplied beyond necessity. That you are better off consolidating your messaging and your branding into a single name. The product and the company is basically the same name, and then building that. You may be aware of your long-term roadmap. You may know that you are going to have multiple products, in which case you need to make a determination. Is this primary name kind of extendable to different products so that they can be distinguished in a portfolio using descriptors? Or is it that our current name and the product name, our company name may not make sense for these other products, in which case maybe it does make sense, and you make that strategic determination. Yes, it is appropriate and justified to come up with a new name for these future products that's unique. But by and large, consolidate, be a branded house, not a house of brands, and build equity in your company name. That's the product name, unless there's some circumstances that really dictate otherwise.
Super. I love you. It's fun to have you as a linguist, because you have some good phrases like step off a curb versus step off the cliff. And now let's bring Chris up, because he has a question about, over to you, Chris.
Hey guys, nice to meet you. So I'm thinking about, besides finding a name that sounds good, that you feel comfortable with, how much do you worry about, trademarks and availability of, classes and goods that you target today, may want to target in the future? I noticed that there are, some trademarks blocked by very large companies that are actually not using them, and like a lot of companies go bust all the time. So how much do you worry about, trademarks potentially being blocked for a name that you really love?
A lot. Like, I lose sleep over that. For me, the trademark, a name is only as good as it is available to you, Okay, and so if you find that maybe for starters, if the name isn't available to you as a trademark now, you need to stop that because you're going to get a cease and desist, or it's fraud. And then 5 years from now, you might have serious equity, but look, we actually now have to change it. And wouldn't you've been better off doing it when you were a smaller company, right? So there is also the matter. Okay, let's say we do have it clear and available as a trademark. And by the way, it is really a good idea to file for trademark protection. Okay, you have your attorneys do that. That is definitely in your best interest. That's not something you want to blow off. That ends up being very costly in the long run, and it doesn't really look. It's not the kind of thing that if you're a responsible building a responsible business that you would do. Just let that slide. So it is something important that you do due diligence on your name through legal counsel, and if it's available authentically, then you file an intent to use to register it as your trademark. Now, what about in the future? We might want to go into these classes and these goods and services and expand. Well, if it's not available in those other areas, then that's going to limit your growth. And that seems like what name is worth that? It seems to me that you're better off kind of biting the bullet and finding a name that is going to be legally available in those other areas. And by the way, one of the challenging things is that with trademarks, it's not cut and dry. It's one big gray area. And so adjacent categories of things, even if it's not you exactly, they're afforded protection. Okay, for existing trademarks. So if you're coming out with a beer and you name it something, you can name it that, right? But let's say there's another company that has wine. You know what? That beer trademark might well be a problem because they're adjacent categories. And the USPTO gives priority to existing marks to give them the allowance to expand into those other areas. Now, companies that aren't actually using marks really, well, is it officially abandoned and a dead mark, or is it looks like it's just not really being used? Well, that's definitely a question for your attorneys. The truth is that the USPTO gives a lot of allowance for companies who have trademarks that are kind of fallow, right? Now, there's cases where they're acting in not good faith and they're kind of squatting across a bunch of things. Again, that's something for your legal counsel. But just because it doesn't appear to be an active use, but it is an active trademark, do not think that you can just go walk on over and use it for those kinds of things or file to also get protection in those areas, because the USPTO will not have any of that. The examiner will say no. So.
Mm-hmm. Actually, my question was also a bit of a different flavor. So I noticed there are some software companies that have their trademark on the entire class of software, which means there can never be any company with the same name selling any sort of software. But then there are some more generic names where you have class software for this really, really specific niche. Like, how do you think about, kind of the name that you love and being able to claim all of software versus, like a niche, right? Maybe like a generic name that works for a niche versus some made up word that you can then claim for, the entire universe of software.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's also kind of my cross to bear as a trademark developer. The truth is that if I'm screening names and I see something in software and my client is in software, albeit a little sliver for something specific, it's out, right? And so if my clients are filing for protection in software, I'm going to want them to have as an advocate for them, I'm going to want them to have the broadest protection possible, right? And so I would strive for the broadest possible protection. And the reason you wouldn't want to do that is that you might be overstepping your bounds, because there's an existing mark that has niche, and if you're claiming all software in their niche, that's not going to fly either. So you might be compelled to kind of dial it back and to be specific, right? But if there's an existing mark out there for software, generally, I'm afraid that it's going to be a barrier to you. Right. So for you, my client, I want you to have the broadest possible protection that you can actually get.
Thanks.
Sure. And I'm not a lawyer. This isn't legal advice. So.
Yes. And as Van said, we can help connect people to lawyers if needed. And let's go over to novel descriptors, terminology, and taglines. Any strategy tips here?
Yeah, so a lot of work I do is in helping companies with describing world's firsts, right? If you come up with something that creates its own category that's never been done, it creates its own thing. It needs a new descriptor, right? It's its own category. And so if your product, company, whatever is its own thing, then you want to take a look at using some kind of descriptor for the software, the platform, whatever it is, and using words, a couple of words that create its own category. Now, the way to do this effectively is to use words that are already in place and to extend them or to pair them in a way that's unique. Okay, so let me go ahead and explain this. There was an appliance, a countertop appliance I named a while back called Cinder. Okay, and it did something nothing else did. It was a kind of countertop appliance, and descriptor development was done. And the first descriptor that we came up with, or that they launched with, was the Cinder sensing cooker. The Cinder sensing cooker. Because you look at sort of what it did and how it worked and its ability to sense temperature, and that made a world of sense. Well, guess what? They launched, and after a couple months in the market, they were getting some feedback. And so they took a look and said, you know what? This isn't the right descriptor. And so they then chose another descriptor on the list, which was the Cinder Precision Grill. Okay. Now, the difference here is that everyone knows what a grill is. What the hell's a cooker, right? And then you add sensing to the mix, and people were befuddled, right? It was a lesson, right? But I know what a grill is, and I get precision, but they had never been paired in that way, right? So the lesson is you take something, maybe that's in your category or adjacent, but you extend it and make it something new. So yes, we're a grill. Let's acknowledge that. We don't need to be some completely newfangled thing, no one's ever heard of. We're a grill, but we're a very special type of grill. And those types of descriptors are the ones most likely to be adopted, understood, and propagated and seen as a valid new object.
And are sometimes the names coming to you from qualitative research or talking to customers and seeing what they bring back to you, or does that never happen in reality?
It rarely happens, though I want it to. I look at research. I look at verbatims. Like I want the raw data of the words people are using to help inform, what I'm doing. I recently working on a pro bono project, and it was for an audience about whom I know nothing, and I have no idea what kind of language they use. And so yes, I needed to find out, kind of looking at research, looking at interviews, what kind of language do they use, so I can kind of channel that. But I don't believe I've ever discovered a name amongst those verbatims. Research generally informs naming in terms of direction. Like, this is the most important benefit, right, of the product, or this is the need that it's solving. And then it establishes kind of a strategy, a direction, or an indication of the ideas that the name needs to support or connote, even if it doesn't hand us an actual name on a silver platter.
Got it.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, we have another question about any input on criteria for naming a community or a network of people.
That's a good question.
I think of it as employees. Sometimes we see this with employees, right? Like at Chegg, we had Cheggsters, the employees, Amazonians, right, at Amazon.
Yeah. I named a company called Wrapped Studio, and they call their employees Raptors. I love it when a name takes on a life of its own and inspires a client to come up with their own nomenclature. It sort of gives you ideas. A good name will keep giving you ideas. So naming a community or a network, I would say, what's the idea you want to reinforce, right? What is the nature of this community and this network? What will galvanize people? What will motivate them? What will distinguish them? Is it a name that characterizes the role of these people? Are they heroes, soldiers, caretakers, like whatever, right? Sort of the way that you frame those people. How do you want to frame them? So think about kind of what sort of role you want them to take on, what the role is of this naming of this name. And that's something I haven't even touched on yet, is you always want to remember, what is the job of this name? Some names just need to communicate clearly, right? Something quickly understood, right? Descriptive names, they need to be a quick get, right? Some names need to grab people by the throat, right? In which case that's going to be more proprietary name. It's going to be some interesting or provocative word, so on and so forth. Some names need to clarify within a system one thing versus another thing. Some names need to, especially descriptive sort of in part nomenclature, need to help distinguish, right? Or point to a feature, right? Or a task, right? So like naming anything, when you name a community or a network of people, what is the objective of the name? What's its job, right? And then you use that to go ahead and sort of establish, you know, what the direction should be and what kind of name you should ultimately have.
Great. We're going to bring up one other person, but in the interest of time, I'll keep asking. If you're using the company name and adding descriptors for each product, do you typically need a trademark for the descriptors?
Oh, well, by their nature, as a general rule, no. Descriptors are by definition descriptive and often generic, and by their nature, they are not protectable, right? So a descriptor is like software, right? Or you have sort of a whole platform and there's different modules. Very often that's going to use descriptive language, right? Now, it is a good idea to ask your lawyer, can we use this name here? Because you'd be shocked, at least I am, to see the kinds of fairly descriptive words that end up affording trademark protection. So it's not that you necessarily need to trademark yours. It's as much about making sure that you're not stepping on anyone's toes. And so it's always a good idea to talk to your attorney. Look, we're going to be going to market. We have our company name. We have these descriptive names for the modules, for these features, whatever they might be, and just say, is it okay that we use these? Do you think that we should attempt to file for trademark protection for any of them? What do you think? So.
And I'm just curious, when you're advising early stage companies, are they just talking to their regular counsel, or are they engaging a special IP trademark lawyer for this kind of stuff? Do you know?
It really depends, but I would always advise talking to a bona fide trademark or IP expert on that. And the reason is that, for one, I mean, I don't know how much a broad counsel is going to know about the likelihood of confusion rules and about all of the body of data that inform whether a name is likely to clear or not clear, because there's all these cases out there that point to one way or another way. It's a massive body of knowledge. And good IP counsel is going to be able to advise you on how to write goods and services descriptions that are going to succeed when put in front of a trademark examiner. In other words, written in a way that conforms with what the USPTO wants, written in such a way that they don't clearly and flagrantly intrude on another mark's protection, right? So they're gonna have this awareness and be able to advise you on how to apply in order to give you the best chance of success. Is it possible general counsel could do that? Yeah, but I assume that an expert in this specific field would be better suited.
Great. Okay, so we have about 5 minutes left, and I think there might be 1 or 2 more questions, but then can you just quickly share the story of naming FitBit or another famous thing that you've done?
Okay, let me clarify. I have named many products for FitBit. I did not name FitBit per se. It's a great name. I love the name. Maybe James Park came up with the name, but it's a great name, and I love the name. They did such a good job with that. I've been lucky enough to name products for FitBit. So the FitBit Blaze and Surge and Ionic and their headsets called Flyers, and most recently FitBit Sense, which I was lucky enough to be invited to help them name. And always interesting because these names have a certain kind of energy to them, and you always want the name to reinforce whatever the brief is. And what's interesting about the Blaze in particular is that someone on my team, I gave them a cloaks briefing to come up with the name. And sometimes I give people on the creative team a totally different brief so that they don't get mired in the category. So I told this namer that I want you to name a new kind of athletic shoe where you can peel off the top of it and replace it with something else so it looks differently really quickly, because this reflected the Blaze and how you could swap out bands. So I took something that was relevant to the product we're naming, brought it over to another category, and had them say, name this new sneaker, where you can take off and change how it looks on the fly like that. And Blaze literally came out of that cloaked briefing, that exercise. And that cloaked briefing, by the way, is applicable to as a technique, really useful for getting you out of a category, freeing you up to come up with names that are surprising, but can be relevant if you articulate that brief in the right way by borrowing from an attribute or a dimension from the actual thing you're naming.
Great. Yeah, well, that's good. Well, I think we're out of time, and we want to give you just an incredible thank you and we will be sharing all the resources on your amazing blog, and just really appreciate your time and expertise, Anthony.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I love talking about this, obviously, and I've enjoyed talking with all of you. Thank you for GPT-3. It's crazy, and I look forward to trying to wrangle it to the ground. So thank you so much.
Really appreciate it. Bye, everybody, and we'll
bye, everyone.
We'll make sure you have the resources and also some attorneys.